on Saturday, May 4th, I am hosting my first workshop at my studio space in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And if you've been listening to the show for a while, then you might remember when I first got that space about 8 or 9 months ago. I've been doing all my live stream classes from there and my teacher's class from there. And now I'm ready. I'm ready to invite my friends and my peers to come hang out with me in this space. It's the first time I'm doing it, and I would love for you to come. If you're in the area, it's in Allentown, Pennsylvania, at a place called the Cigar Factory. It's a super cool spot that not many people know about, and I'm just excited. I'm excited to share in this space that I created. If you've never met me before, it would be an opportunity to just learn about what I'm doing and sharing some of the practice and the approach. And if you do know me, if you're an old friend, get in your car, take a drive, come hang out with me. I would love to see you. We'll have a cup of tea, we'll hang out, we'll have yoga together. Saturday, May 4th in Allentown, Pennsylvania. You can find out about it at jbrownyoga.com. All right. Do you know what time it is? Do you? Of course you do, because you just hit play. So you know that it's time for Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. And my name is Jay Brown. Hello to old and new friends. What's going on? I am recording this well in advance of when I normally would. It's much earlier in the week than I ever do these intros. But I've got this gig this weekend. I'm going to Brazil, which is great. But in order to get to Brazil, I have to do these red-eye flights. And it's really gonna mess with stuff. And I just don't see where there's going to even be a window to do this later in the week. So it's got to happen now or never, my friends. But it doesn't matter because today is the day. I have been talking for months about wanting to have a conversation about CBD. And today I will make good on that. Dr. Aimée Shunney is here with us. And I'm not going to say much about it. The conversation speaks all for itself. And frankly, there's a few things, if you listen careful, a few things that I mention in this conversation, which I feel warrant a bit of follow-up, which I will do on the other side. So if you listen careful, you might be able to pick out what I think I want to mention. Just a few things that I think are interesting and, I don't know, bear relevance to me and part of why even I think it's taken so long for this conversation to be had on the show. In any case, that'll happen on the other side. And today you're going to listen to Dr. Aimée Shunney, who I haven't ever met before this conversation. Really, I just did some research online looking for experts on CBD. And she was somebody who kept showing up on a list. And she just seemed the most intriguing. She was one of the few women on the list, honestly. And something about her struck me as something I could relate to. And sure enough, you'll get to hear. We have a wonderful conversation. I'm very excited for you to hear it today. Before we do, another really cool thing happened. Just the other day, I recorded a conversation with Jim Mallinson. Do you guys know Jim Mallinson? Probably a lot of you do. Those of you who don't will get to know him next month. But it was wonderful because Jim was listening to the show, to a conversation I had with Seth Powell a few months ago. And he was listening to this talk I had with Seth while he was driving through the deserts of India. And in the conversation with Seth, I referenced Jim and how I was maybe a little bit intimidated by the kind of scholarship and the academic rigor that they're bringing to the work that they're doing. And So Jim, he reached out to me. He sent me an email, and it led to this wonderful conversation. And I'm mentioning it because coming away from talking to him, it really struck me how valuable studying the history and philosophies of yoga and Sanskrit can really be a source of inspiration and education for people who are passionate about yoga. And one really great place to do that is yogicstudies.com. That is the online educational resource of Seth Powell, the guy I was talking to when Jim heard me mention him. And Seth is somebody I know. I took his course, his history and philosophies course, and it was wonderful. I learned a lot. Seth's a very gifted teacher, and he has a way of presenting stuff that's normally feels kind of like, would normally go over my head, but he presents it in a way that makes it really accessible and digestible. So if you want to expand your knowledge of yoga history, philosophy, and Sanskrit language, Yogic Studies is the place to do it. And as a listener of the show, you can get 15% off if you use promo code JBrown15. That's 15% off with promo code JBrown15. Go to yogicstudies.com. Also, let me drop my stuff. I'm going to be in Allentown, Pennsylvania, May 4th. I'm going to be in Australia, May 25th through June 2nd. Sydney, Gold Coast, and Melbourne. Sydney's filling up some. Gold Coast and Melbourne still space. Australia, May 25th through June 2nd. I'm also going to be in Rhinebeck, New York at the Omega Institute, June 17th through 21st. And I'm going to be in Helena, Montana at the Feathered Pipe Ranch, August 17th through 24th. You can find out about those gigs and more. You can listen to the archives of the podcast and read my blog and find all of my online yoga video offerings. Everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, that's going to just be it. As I mentioned, I am going to touch base with you on the other side. There's a few follow-up comments I want to make to today's talk. I want to say a few things again about the next few episodes, which are about some pain science and changing view of the human body, which Aimée and I do discuss very briefly today, but we're going to talk about it a lot more in the coming weeks, and I'm going to say a little bit about that on the other side. But other than that, as I said, it's kind of early in the week, and I'm a little bit out of sorts, to be honest. I'm off of my usual routine, so we're just going to leave it here, and we're going to go ahead and get to it. Let's have a conversation about CBD with Dr. Aimée Shunney. Hello?
Hi, Jay, it's Aimée. Can you hear me?
I can, Aimée. Hello.
Oh, yay.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for this, Aimée. It's really a pleasure to get a chance to speak with you, and I just appreciate you giving me some of your time. We don't know each other at all. I just sent you some blind email, and then you agreed to give me your time, and I really value that, so thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
And, I think I told you in my email, this is like a conversation I've been wanting to have for a while. This podcast is often focused on, a lot of yoga industry stuff. Like the way I came into yoga in my early 20s when it was like still kind of an underground thing. Now I'm in my mid 40s and I got 2 kids and it's this big mainstream thing. I had a yoga center in Williamsburg, Brooklyn for a lot of years. I sold it 2 years ago. And, what happened is like the last few years of the center, things got not great for me. My life went in a kind of a bad spiral. I was taking on debt and started having lots of physical pain, which was really a problematic thing for me because, my focus as a yoga teacher is having a therapeutic orientation. So like it's my job to help people lessen their pain and stress and stuff. Like that's been my focus. And I had a lot of tools that were like really effective and had helped me in the past and were helping a lot of other people. But in this moment, they kind of failed me. And I think that a lot of people in the yoga world, honestly, I don't know how much you would know about it, but there's been a lot of pretty big changes happening in the yoga world, where things that we were taught and the ideas that we had about what we were doing with our bodies to heal people ended up not being entirely accurate and being problematic. So there's a lot of reevaluating going on. And so I was going through this whole process and having like really big pain issues, debilitating pain issues for the first time in my life. And faked it for a little while, like tried to pretend I was okay, and then just couldn't. And then started this podcast. And in the early days of this podcast, if people go listen, they'll hear me like crying in the intros, you know, like just admitting, like yoga teachers don't like to admit when they have pain either, because pain's almost seen like a weakness.
Sure.
So anyway, this is a long-winded introduction to start us off here, because at some point I made a bunch of changes that definitely like helped turn it around some, just like getting myself into a better life situation, changing what I was doing with my body a lot. But one of the things that I did do was start taking CBD oil, because if somebody mentioned it, because my issue is like kind of chronic inflammation pain. And they suggested that I might try that. And so I did, and I went through like a whole long process of sort of like trying it out, like doing, like I'm a very experiential learner. So, you know, I bought like 10 different brands and tried isolates and full spectrums in like different dosages, and then would try it for a week and see how that felt, or a couple weeks, and then would take a week off and see if I could feel a difference. And sort of went through this whole process of really recognizing that this definitely helped me. Like, like it was unquestionable how much lower my pain levels were when I was taking it. And I found like a right dosage, and a lot of some stuff not only lessened, like kind of went away. And it's been a complete game changer. And I haven't been talking about it because I'm not prescriptive, and I don't talk about nutrition and like give advice or anything like that. You know, it's not what I'm about. But it's definitely, I cannot deny that it's helped me. And when I've done a bunch of research into it to try to learn about it, like, okay, well, why? Why is this helping me? You know, is this just a placebo effect? Is this real? You know? And ultimately, I started learning about the endocannabinoid system. And it seems like that's pretty, from what I can tell, we've only recently really learned about that. Like I saw somewhere like late 80s, early 90s. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, it was named in the late 90s after a discovery in the late 80s of a cannabinoid receptor in a mouse brain. And then some scientists went on throughout the early 90s to identify cannabinoid receptor systems in 6 different mammalian species, including humans. And then 94, 95, I believe, those scientists, of course, were now on a quest to figure out what these cannabinoid receptors were for in our bodies. And they actually discovered that we make cannabis-like compounds in our bodies called endocannabinoids. So endo being short for endogenous, something that we make ourselves. And then 2 major ones have been studied. The first one was named anandamide, after the Sanskrit word for bliss. And then the second one just got stuck with the 2-AG, 2-arachidonyl glycerol. But those 2 endocannabinoids, coupled with these 2 types of cannabinoid receptors that they found throughout our bodies, in every organ system of our bodies, they then kind of put together in the late 90s and said, this is what makes up the endocannabinoid system. We actually each have an endocannabinoid system, and it has a multitude of jobs, but its overarching occupation is homeostasis and balance throughout the body. So it's pretty amazing that this core physiologic system wasn't even named until the 90s, and to this day is not being taught to healthcare professionals as part of their education. So the only reason anybody's learning about this stuff is because they're interested and they're looking for their own edification.
Well, it plays right into kind of a narrative I've been following, which is more generally speaking, when I was trying to address this pain in lots of different ways. I reached out and had like a number of different pain science people on this show and sort of talking to them about the cutting edge of the research there. And one of the things that kind of blew my mind, which is what this speaks to, is that like the human anatomy, like our understanding of human anatomy, in some regards, it's almost been rewritten in the last 20 years. Like things that were taught 20 years ago about the body, we no longer teach. And sometimes in the yoga world, when people want to get smart about yoga, they look to anatomy and the sciences to kind of be the answer. But it's talked about almost as science as though it's a fixed thing. But it seems to me that it's an evolving understanding. And this points to it, that there's this whole system in our body that we're only really beginning to understand.
Yeah. And of course, it's the idea that we treat science like it's static is preposterous when you talk about it in a conversation like this, right? And yet, I think all of us, whether you're a yoga practitioner, you're a healthcare provider, you're a therapist, whatever you are, we get taught what we get taught. We get indoctrinated in the efficacy of what we get taught. And when new things come along, we have a healthy amount of skepticism around changing what we've been taught to do, what we feel like we know works. And of course, that healthy skepticism is important. Otherwise, you do all kinds of stuff that wouldn't be very good for anybody. But I think that most people, particularly I think the longer you've been practicing whatever you practice, we get dogged about letting go of whatever it is we've been using. And I think that certainly in regards, not only to cannabis medicine, but, pain, how we perceive pain, how we measure pain, how we treat pain. I mean, even the concept of chronic inflammation, which I was taught about in naturopathic medical school 20 years ago, but which has really only mainstreamed as a concept in the last, 5 to 7 years. All of this particular area, I think is something where we've been having a really hard time figuring out how to take care of well. And it's becoming crystal clear that certainly what conventional medicine has been doing does not work and is very dangerous. And and that's dovetailing with this kind of, resurgence of cannabis medicine, this demand for knowledge and information and access. I mean, it's fascinating to watch and be a part of.
It really is. And, what I think is important is that, there is like a lot of kind of bullshit out there. Like, sometimes I see like all these like beauty products with CBD in them and stuff. And I'm like, because that doesn't fit with what my inquiry into it has been, And, you mentioned, to get to some of that inquiry, you mentioned these receptors.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of sparked the discovery. And I was very intrigued to learn about these receptors. Like there's CB1 and CB2. And go ahead. What were you going to say about them?
Well, I was going to flesh that out for you a little bit. Do you want me to do that?
Yeah. Go ahead. Please do.
So CB1 and CB2 are the two types of cannabinoid receptors that have been isolated. And they, as I said, they are both in every organ system of the body, right? So the beauty products can seem like bullshit. And you bet there's a lot of BS on the market right now. I mean, there's over 850 hemp-derived CBD companies on the scene right now. I mean, this has exploded. And there's a lot of garbage, as with all supplements, right? But there's some really good stuff too. But I'll tell you, somebody asked me to write an article about CBD and skin, which I had done no research for previously. And I just started to dip my toe in. And you can find heavy hitter, peer-reviewed dermatology articles, data, talking about dermatologists looking at CBD as anti-inflammatory and treating the sebaceous glands for acne, as being excellent at treating the itch, in quotes, the chronic itch that they slap, steroids on forever because they don't know how to deal with it. Psoriasis, dermatitis. So I just add that because
it is kind of legit. There are some applications. It's not.
It is legit. So anyway, back to these receptors. So CB1 receptors are most densely distributed in the brain. And in fact, CB1 receptors are the most densely distributed receptor type in the entire human brain, which is crazy since we didn't know it existed before the 90s. So we have lots of these CB1 receptors in the brain and throughout the body, and particularly in the part of the brain that's called the limbic system. The limbic system consists of several different structures and networks of cells, including, some areas that you might be familiar with, like the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex. But basically, this limbic system is in charge of our entire emotional life. All of our emotional states, our instincts, our drives, our ability to remember, our ability to forget, which is a very adaptive function. We're constantly worried about forgetting, but there are certain things we're supposed to forget. And when we lose the ability to do that, we have things like PTSD, anxiety, right? Things like the panic disorder. So the endocannabinoid system and the cannabinoid receptors located in that part of the brain are incredibly crucial for things, all the things I just named, our stress response, our mood. And in regards to pain, obviously perception of pain is a tremendous part of how we respond to it and how we handle treatment of that pain. So the emotional kind of amygdala-derived response to pain is super important for helping us diminish pain as well. And then in addition to those CB1 receptors, we have the CB2 receptors, again, in every organ system of the body, but most densely distributed in the periphery, in the immune tissue. So you're going to read a lot about the importance of CB2 receptors when it comes to a pro or anti-inflammatory environment in the body, and also modulating the immune system. So CBD as a cannabinoid that can potentially impact these cannabinoid receptors, you can start to see how whether it's your own endogenously produced cannabinoids or if it's something from the outside like a phytocannabinoid like CBD, anything that can impact these cannabinoid receptors is going to be crucial for your stress response, your emotional state, cognitive function, pain perception, immune modulation, and inflammation. And then if that wasn't enough, what we've also learned is that these cannabinoids, whether they are from our own bodies or from a plant or from a pharmaceutical, because those are out there and more of them are coming too, not only do they impact the cannabinoid receptors, but they impact, dozens of other types of receptor sites in the body. So again, switching gears to CBD, for example, CBD not only impacts CB1 and CB2, but it impacts our serotonin receptors. It impacts our GABA receptors. So more of that anti-anxiety, calming, antidepressant response. It also impacts various receptor sites that are crucial for an anti-inflammatory / analgesic environment. So again, it's alphabet soup over here, but PPAR receptors and TRPV1 receptors. I mean, there's just a whole host of ways in which these phytocannabinoids and our own endocannabinoids act in the body. So it's not just on those cannabinoid receptors. It's pretty amazing.
I mean, I have to say, there's like so many things weaving together here for me, because when I've been looking into like pain, and you talked about it, how like so much of it is about perception. And like if you think something's going to hurt you before you do it, it hurts. The chances of it hurting you are much greater than if you don't. And they know that. They've shown that. And then some of like my own reduction of pain, it has been about like reducing the factors that seem to be taking me out of a natural stasis that my body wants to go to. And so taking the CBD, definitely, it isn't like taking like a Advil or something like that, but the effect of it on my system is an overall thing that does seem to be kind of hitting on all these different levels like you were pointing to.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I guess the other thing I was going to ask about these receptors, because I read something about them and I want you to tell me if it's true or not. Like this system in our bodies, this CB1 and CB2 receptors, they are specifically for cannabinoids. And other than like our bodies, do these cannabinoids exist outside of cannabis?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So CBD and THC, of course, these are 2 of over 80 different cannabinoids that have been isolated from the cannabis plant, right? And we discovered CBD and THC back in the 1940s and 1950s. We knew they existed. And we hypothesized that it was this novel class of phytochemicals called cannabinoids that were responsible for all the effects of cannabis. But we didn't figure out why until we discovered the receptors in the 80s, right? But we've discovered since then that there are other plants that have cannabinoids in them. Echinacea, chocolate, liverwort, which is not one that you probably use very often, but there's a variety of plants that have cannabinoids in them as well. So it's actually not unique to cannabis. They're certainly most dense in cannabis. We make them ourselves, of course, these endocannabinoids, and then we have what I call pharmacannabinoids or synthetic cannabinoids, which are agents that can modulate, stimulate, inhibit the cannabinoid receptors that are made in the laboratory, sometimes from cloned plants, often from isolates, and sometimes completely synthetic molecules. So it's really not enough to say cannabinoids anymore, is it? You really have to use a prefix so that you're identifying the origin of your cannabinoid, phyto, endo, pharma, something along those lines. And the thing to remember is that regardless of origin, what these cannabinoids are doing is impacting a person's endocannabinoid system, right? And so when we look at the endocannabinoid system, we are looking for things like, and of course we have no biomarkers that are available outside of the research arena to actually measure this yet. I think we will someday, but what we're trying to gauge is this person making enough endocannabinoids? Are they potentially making too many? Making too many is not usually an issue, but what can be an issue is that the different cannabinoid receptors are getting over or understimulated, creating a problem with balance or tone. And so those CB1 receptors, for example, that are so densely distributed in the brain, a sedentary lifestyle, eating, high sugar, high calorie foods that are high in omega-6 seed oils and low in omega-3 fats, and lots of stress, and lots of inflammation and being overweight and sedentary. All of those things can contribute, for example, to the CB1 receptors being grossly overstimulated, creating too much endocannabinoid tone, and that can push somebody into more pain, more inflammation, more metabolic issues, more anxiety, etc. So we look at these different types of cannabinoids as being potentially helpful in helping restore proper endocannabinoid tone and also proper endocannabinoid production. Where CBD comes in as like this superstar right now is that unlike any other phytocannabinoid we've looked at yet, and unlike any other synthetic or pharmacannabinoid we've seen yet, CBD seems to have a real affinity to come in and support endocannabinoid production, helps us keep our anandamide and 2-AG levels optimal, and helps with that endocannabinoid tone. It actually can help to dampen that CB1 overstimulation. CBD also has tremendous affinity for the serotonin receptors where, it kind of does double duty with a lot of those other things I just mentioned. CBD has already 65 distinct molecular targets that have been identified for how it works. And that includes enzymes and transport channels and receptor sites. So it's this incredible tool to help balance the endocannabinoid system. And the safety profile at this point seems to be exceptional. It's been a game changer for you. It's been a game changer for me in my practice.
Well, I want to get to that. But I want to also say that you kind of said an important thing, because I observed that even just in my own use of it, that it isn't about like more cannabinoids equals better. It's a balancing. Like I took too much and got tired and it could feel like out of balance. But
yes.
And sometimes now, like some days I don't need it, or just to, it's about a balancing effect more than just like a application on a symptom or something
yes,
like that.
Exactly. And that's because we're working on a system, just like you said. I mean, how fantastic is it that some days you need less, right? One of the things people say to me all the time is, am I going to develop tolerance to this? Like, am I just going to need to keep taking more? And I feel very comfortable, 3.5 years into using this with patients, saying to people, actually what I observe is the opposite, that as the endocannabinoid system becomes more balanced and the tone is optimized, people will find that they just need to use less. And then they'll truck along like that for a while. And then something will happen and things will get out of balance again. And then they might need to use more. But the beauty of using the CBD is that, it's fast acting and it can be used, as needed. And you may be getting this acute symptom relief like you're talking about, for you, less pain. Mm-hmm. For somebody else, it could be less anxiety, sleeping better, whatever it is. But underneath, we're actually helping to create more balance in the body, which, for me as a trained naturopathic physician, that's a win-win, right? Because I don't want to just treat symptoms. I want to actually help the body move into better health and better balance.
Well, I feel like I also need to say that there was not like a block for me, but, I've been a long time cannabis smoker. I grew up in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And I've been smoking cannabis since I was 15 years old. There were times in my life where it played unhealthy roles, and there are times in my place where it's definitely played healthy roles, continues to play a healthy role for me. And I always had this idea when I first heard about CBD, I was like, yeah, I smoke weed. What's it going to do different? But I did learn that, one, I never eat it. And I think that when you eat cannabis, it's an entirely different thing in my experience. It almost, I think I was reading about, like, it goes through a whole different process in your body. And so something about, I have to say, taking the CBD, it doesn't make you high. I think that's kind of an important point to make. Like, I don't, because I know what it is to smoke weed and get high, and CBD doesn't get me high. It definitely doesn't. I think it's important. There's all kinds of taboo around cannabis. My sister lives in Washington where it's legal, and even still there, people have ideas about it where it's like, oh, you're a loser. And so I don't know. I feel like it's sort of important to make some distinctions between what we're talking about with taking the CBD oil and what it is like when you smoke weed or when you eat weed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often say to patients, I said, if you try to use this stuff to get high, you're going to be dismally disappointed.
Yes. It's not going to be that good. Yeah.
No, it's not. It's not going to be the experience you're looking for. But yeah, all of these cannabinoids, CBD, THC, CBN, CBDA, there's a new one that we're talking about every day. You can get these cannabinoids from hemp, and you can get them from marijuana. And both hemp and marijuana come from the cannabis sativa plant. So if we look at the taxonomy of the plant, it's cannabis sativa, and then depending on who you talk to, there are several subspecies of cannabis sativa. One is called cannabis sativa L. The L is for Linnaeus, who's the botanist who named it. Then you have cannabis indica, and then you have cannabis ruderalis. Now, again, depending on who you talk to, they might completely refute that. A lot of people are talking about throwing out that whole classification system, but that's what we have right now. So when most people say sativa, they're talking about sativa L, right? They're talking about sativa L and indica. These are the main strains that people talk about. Again, that's another word that a lot of people want to get rid of because they don't think it's really accurate.
Well, just to jump in, when I was in Washington, they were talking about those almost like you talk about wines.
Yes.
Like sativas are for the young people because they want to get pepped up, and the indicas are to calm down for the older people. Like they were observing trends and stuff.
Right. Yeah, no, people say to me all the time, I take my sativa during the day and then I take my indica to sleep, right?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
So, what we have to remember is that there is more than CBD and THC in this plant, right? We've got, like I said, over 80 different cannabinoids. You've got terpenes, which are a whole other class of phytochemical. Beta-carophylline is probably the one you've heard the most about, but there's I don't know how many there are, but I would guess that there's 100 or more. And they have their own anti-inflammatory, analgesic, anti-anxiety properties. There's flavonoids, which are incredible antioxidants. There's chlorophyll. There's plant sterols, which have an FDA-approved claim for heart health in their own supplements. There's all 8 isomers of vitamin E. There's what else? There's fatty acids. It's a rich fatty acids in there, and that's why our own fatty acid intake can impact our endocannabinoid system. So you've got all that happening, and then you've got different seeds. You've got over 20 certified genetic hemp seeds approved by the USDA, and then you've got a whole host of, kind of drug variety marijuana seeds. And whatever that seed or cultivar is another word for that, whatever that seed or cultivar is going to dictate which cannabinoids are in there. Is the THC high? Is the THC low? Is it high fiber? Is it low fiber? What's the terpene content like? What's the fatty acid content look like? So we're talking CBD, we're talking THC, we're talking strain, right? But what it really comes back to is what seed or cultivar is this raw material from? Because that's really going to dictate how it feels for you. Does it pep you up? Does it put you to sleep? Is it better for pain? Is it better for anxiety? And these are things that we don't really know how to tell the difference from yet. But when you talk to people who are experimenting with different products, they will tell you, this one helped me, this one didn't, this one kept me up, this one put me to sleep, this one made me depressed. And it's because of that mix. Now, the THC, as far as we know, is the component that makes people feel intoxicated. And you can get, if you're looking for CBD, you can find CBD in a low THC product. You can find CBD in a high THC product. It depends on your source. So that brings me back to cannabis sativa L, marijuana, and hemp, right? So you can get high THC products from any of the cannabis sativa subspecies, but hemp, agricultural or industrial hemp, only comes from cannabis sativa L. And the way that you differentiate hemp from marijuana that's coming from cannabis sativa L is solely, and this is a legal definition, I plant scientists would disagree, but for our legal definition of what separates those two things is the THC content. And to legally be hemp, it has to have 0.3% THC dry weight when the plant is harvested. If it has more than 0.3%, it is marijuana, and it is not legal. Right? It is still subject to whatever state and federal regulations are around marijuana and cannabis in that state. Hemp is now federally lawful since the passing of the 2019 Farm Bill, which just happened in January.
Yes, I read about that.
Yeah, so that includes hemp, and that includes all cannabinoids that come from hemp, even the little bit of THC that's in hemp. It's all legal if it comes from hemp. Hemp has been removed from the Controlled Substances Act officially and returned to what I would say is its rightful place as a, USDA agricultural commodity. So CBD as an isolate, CBD from a hemp product will not get you high. CBD from a marijuana product might get you high because in a marijuana product you can have very low THC, but the THC could be as high as 30%, or even more. So you do have to really know your source to understand what your THC content is and whether or not this is going to be intoxicating for you.
Well, thanks for all that information. I know when I was in Washington with my sister, she took me to a spot where they listed it. They had like percentages of what they were offering. And I do know that there is this difference between a full spectrum and an isolate. And yes. I think that was something I kind of had to sort through as well. So maybe you could explain to people listening what the difference is between a full spectrum and an isolate product.
Sure. So, an isolate is something that is going to have all of those other constituents refined away that I mentioned, except for the CBD. So it won't have any THC. It won't have any of the other cannabinoids. It won't have terpenes or flavonoids or essential fats or vitamin E or any of those things. It is CBD. And my sense of the industry is that we're going to have a hard time keeping CBD isolates available without a prescription, because CBD isolates, I mean, they're very close to, that's a drug, right? By my own definition of, drugs often start out as natural substances. We identify one constituent which we think is the cause of whatever benefit we're looking for, and then we isolate it and we try to find a magic dose and apply it, right? So, I mean, that's the Western pharmaceutical philosophy paradigm right there. And in a sense, that's what we've done with CBD. Last year, there was a CBD isolate approved as a drug for pediatric epilepsy. It's called Epidiolex, and it's from a British pharmaceutical house called GW Pharma. So, now that we've got a CBD isolate drug, I think it's going to be hard to keep CBD isolates available. But, we'll see how that goes. A full spectrum CBD oil is going to contain all of those other constituents that I mentioned, flavonoids and terpenes and other cannabinoids, et cetera, including trace amounts of THC, unless the company says that they have explicitly removed that, which some companies do, because some people are very sensitive about the idea of having any THC in their products. So, I think that there's an idea in the industry that the full spectrum products have a synergistic effect, often called an entourage effect of, how the different components work together, and that the kind of sum is more than the single ingredient. I have some people who really like the isolate. I think with the isolates, you tend to have to take a lot more of it. And I think there's much more potential for adverse effect as well as interaction with other drugs.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, because I didn't find it as effective for myself personally.
Yeah.
And I don't have the same kind of concerns. I know, like, people get drug tested at work and stuff. Like, there is so many taboos around it. Mm-hmm. But I definitely have felt like the full spectrum, it has a very different effect and seemed to help me a lot more than the isolates. That's been my experience too. And like I said, I mean, I think the isolate is more of a drug model of CBD. And I mean, there's going to be a lot of cannabis pharmaceuticals coming down the pipe. And I feel like, whatever, we can't stop big pharma. We know that. But
if you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.